They found them living in a basement in Kansas City. Two elderly men who hadn't seen daylight in 43 years. When the police descended those concrete steps in October of 1959, they expected to find a meth lab, maybe stolen goods. What they found instead were brothers. The Dalton brothers, men the town had buried twice, once in their minds and once in the town records. But here they were, breathing, waiting. And when the younger one finally spoke, his first words made the officers step back toward the stairs. "We've been expecting you," he said. "Mother told us you'd come when we were ready to confess." Their mother had been dead for 17 years. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Dalton family name carried weight in Lawrence County, Missouri. The kind of weight that made people lower their voices when they walked past the old Dalton property on Route 44. For 3 generations, the Daltons had owned the limestone quarry that employed half the county. They were church elders, school board members, the kind of family whose photographs hung in the county courthouse lobby next to the founders. But something happened to that family between 1916 and 1959, something that turned their name from a point of pride into a whispered curse that mothers used to keep their children from wandering too far into the woods after dark. Robert and Samuel Dalton were born 13 months apart. Robert in December of 191, Samuel in January of 193. Their father, William Dalton, ran the quarry with an iron fist and a leather strap he kept hanging on a nail in the kitchen. Their mother, Catherine, was a small woman with hollow eyes who spent most of her time in the upstairs bedroom, curtains drawn, speaking to someone no one else could see. Neighbors remembered her as delicate, which was the word people used back then when they meant broken, but didn't want to say it out loud. The boys were inseparable in that way that brothers sometimes are when the world outside their bond feels unsafe. They shared a bedroom in the attic, shared clothes, shared secrets. Robert was the protector, stocky, quiet, with their father's broad shoulders and their mother's dark, watchful eyes. Samuel was smaller, softer, the kind of boy who collected bird feathers and spent hours arranging them by color and size on the windowsill. The other children at school called him strange. They called him worse things, too. Things that made Robert's fists clench and his jaw tighten. Things that led to bloody noses in the schoolyard and visits to the principal's office. That always ended with William Dalton's leather straps singing against skin in the barn after dinner. By the time Robert turned 16, he'd stopped going to school altogether. He worked the quarry with his father, came home covered in limestone dust, ate dinner in silence, and disappeared upstairs to the attic where Samuel waited with his books and his feathers and his soft voice that only Robert ever really listened to. And maybe that's where it started. In that attic room where the August heat made the air thick and hard to breathe, where two brothers became something more than brothers, became a single organism with 2 hearts beating in rhythm, became the kind of secret that a family like the Daltons couldn't afford to let see daylight. But secrets have a way of growing in the dark, feeding on shame and silence until they become something monstrous, something that demands to be fed. The first disappearance happened in the spring of 1917. A traveling salesman named Howard Finch had stopped at the Dalton property to ask directions to the next town. He was seen talking to William Dalton near the quarry entrance just after noon. He was never seen leaving. His automobile was found 3 days later, stripped and pushed into a ravine 15 miles away. The sheriff at the time, a man named Albert Goss, who happened to be William Dalton's brother-in-law, ruled it an accident, said Finch must have gotten lost, abandoned his vehicle, and wandered off into the woods. Never mind that Finch's luggage was still in the car. Never mind the reports from the quarry workers who swore they'd heard shouting that afternoon. Then silence, then the sound of machinery running long after the workday should have ended. Catherine Dalton changed after that spring. The neighbors noticed at first how she stopped going to church, stopped answering the door, stopped speaking in complete sentences. When anyone managed to catch her on the porch, she started wearing the same dress every day, a gray cotton thing that hung off her shrinking frame like a burial shroud. She started talking about penance, about blood debts, about how the Lord required sacrifices from the faithful, and how Abraham had been willing to raise the knife over his own son's throat. The pastor came to visit her twice. He didn't come a third time. Years later, when he was dying of stomach cancer, he told his wife that there was something in Catherine Dalton's eyes that made him understand why the ancient Israelites had forbidden people from speaking God's true name aloud. Robert and Samuel was 16 and 15 that spring, old enough to understand what silence meant, old enough to learn that loyalty to family was measured not in words, but in what you were willing to bury. The quarry was deep, over 100 feet in some places, and the limestone had a way of holding on to things, of keeping secrets pressed between its ancient layers like flowers in a Bible. William Dalton knew this. His father had known this, and now his sons knew it, too. The second disappearance came in 1918. A young woman named Mary Bishop, who'd gotten pregnant by someone she wouldn't name. She'd come to the Dalton house looking for work, desperate and showing, the kind of desperate that made people stupid and willing to believe in kindness where there was none. Catherine had answered the door. Catherine had smiled. Catherine had invited her in for tea and asked her about her circumstances in that gentle maternal way that made Mary's eyes fill with tears of relief. The quarry workers found Mary's shoe 3 weeks later, half buried in the limestone tailings. Just the shoe, never the girl. Sheriff Goss said she'd probably run off to Kansas City to have the baby in secret, the way loose girls did back then. He said it with William Dalton standing right there beside him, nodding his agreement, while Robert and Samuel watched from the porch with their mother's dark eyes and their father's stone-cold faces. By 1922, there had been 7 disappearances in Lawrence County, 7 people who had last been seen near the Dalton property or the quarry, 7 investigations that went nowhere, filed away in folders that gathered dust in the sheriff's office. People whispered, of course. People always whisper. But the Daltons had money, had influence, had 3 generations of respectability built up like a wall around their sins, and in a town where the quarry provided jobs for 73 families, where William Dalton's signature appeared on paychecks every Friday afternoon. People learned to whisper quietly and look the other way. That was the year William Dalton died. They found him at the bottom of the quarry on a Monday morning in October, his skull crushed, his body broken against the limestone like something that had been dropped from a great height. The workers said it was an accident, said he must have gotten too close to the edge, lost his footing, fallen. Robert, who discovered the body, said the same thing when Sheriff Goss came to investigate, said it through tears that looked real enough, through a voice that shook with what could have been grief, or could have been something else entirely. The funeral was well attended. The whole town came to pay their respects to one of Lawrence County's founding families. Catherine stood at the graveside in her gray dress, silent and still as a tombstone, while Robert and Samuel flanked her like sentries. When the preacher spoke about William Dalton's contributions to the community, about his dedication to family and tradition, Catherine started laughing, not loud, just a low, wet sound that came from somewhere deep in her chest. She laughed until Robert took her arm and led her back to the automobile, and even then, people said they could hear it echoing across the cemetery, like something that didn't quite belong to a human throat. The quarry closed 6 weeks later. Robert was 21 years old, legally old enough to inherit, but he told the county he was shutting it down permanently, said his mother needed him at home, said Samuel needed him, too. The workers were angry. 73 families suddenly without income. But what could they do? The Daltons owned the land, owned the equipment, owned the houses half the workers lived in. Within a year, most of those families had moved away, chasing work in other towns, other counties, other lives that didn't revolve around limestone dust and secrets buried to 100 feet deep. The Dalton house became a place people avoided. It sat there on Route 44. 3 stories of Victorian architecture slowly rotting from the inside out, curtains always drawn, the yard growing wild and strange. Sometimes at night, people driving past would see a light in the attic window. Sometimes they'd see shadows moving behind the glass, 2 figures that moved in perfect synchronization, like dancers or like two-halves of something that had been split apart and sewn back together. Wrong. Children dared each other to knock on the door. None of them ever did. There was something about that house, something that made your skin crawl and your throat tighten, something that whispered in the reptile part of your brain that some doors were meant to stay closed. Catherine Dalton died in 1942. At least that's when the county recorded her death. The truth is, nobody saw her die. Nobody saw a body. Robert came into town one morning in March and reported to the county clerk that his mother had passed peacefully in her sleep. He had the death certificate signed by a doctor in Springfield, who'd never actually visited the property, who'd signed based on Robert's description of her symptoms over the telephone. The funeral was private. Just Robert and Samuel and a gravestone that appeared in the family plot behind the house. No service, no witnesses. Just a date carved into granite that may or may not have meant anything at all. After Catherine's death, the brothers stopped coming into town entirely. They had groceries delivered, strange orders that arrived monthly, paid for with cash that Robert left in an envelope on the porch, canned goods, flour, sugar, kerosene, medical supplies, enough morphine to raise eyebrows if anyone had been paying close enough attention. The delivery drivers said the brothers looked like ghosts, pale and thin, speaking in whispers when they spoke at all. They said the house smelled wrong, like copper and limestone dust, and something sweet and rotten underneath. They said there were rooms in that house where the doors were nailed shut from the outside, where you could hear sounds if you listened close enough, sounds that might have been wind in the walls, or might have been something else, something that had been locked away for so long, it had forgotten how to be quiet. The town forgot about the Dalton the way towns forget about inconvenient things. Life moved on. The war came and went. Boys who'd grown up hearing stories about the haunted house on Route 44 went off to fight in Europe and the Pacific, and some of them came home and some of them didn't, and nobody had time to worry about two hermit brothers living in their dead mother's house. Sheriff Goss died in 1947. His replacement, a young man named Thomas Wade, who'd moved to Lawrence County from St. Louis, had never heard the old stories, didn't know about the disappearances or the whispers or the way the previous generation had learned to look away when it came to the Dalton family. By 1959, Robert Dalton would have been 57 years old. Samuel would have been 56, but nobody in Lawrence County could have told you if they were alive or dead. The house stood empty or appeared to stand empty. The windows dark, the porch sagging, the yard consumed by 30 years of neglect. The property taxes went unpaid. The county started proceedings to claim the land. That's when someone remembered that the Daltons had family in Kansas City. A cousin, a woman named Dorothy Marsh, who hadn't spoken to her relatives in 40 years, but who was, according to the records, the last living blood relative besides Robert and Samuel themselves. The county contacted her in September of 1959. They asked if she knew what had become of her cousins. She said she'd assumed they were dead. She said nobody had heard from them since before the war. She said if the county wanted to claim the property for unpaid taxes, she wouldn't contest it. But Dorothy Marsh made a mistake. She mentioned the conversation to her neighbor, and her neighbor mentioned it to someone else, and that someone else happened to know a reporter for the Kansas City Star, who was always looking for human interest stories, the kind of stories that made people feel something. Over their morning coffee, the reporter's name was James Sullivan. He was 28 years old, ambitious, the kind of journalist who believed that every small town had secrets worth uncovering. He drove down to Lawrence County in early October of 1959 with a notebook and a camera, and a head full of romantic notions about forgotten families and abandoned houses. He found the Dalton property. On a Tuesday afternoon, the house looked dead. The windows were filmed over with decades of grime. The front door hung crooked on its hinges, but when Sullivan walked around to the back of the house, he noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt near the basement entrance, fresh footprints, and there was a smell coming from the basement door, faint but distinct food. Someone was cooking food. Sullivan knocked on the basement door. He waited. He knocked again, and then he heard it. Footsteps. Slow, shuffling footsteps, climbing stairs. The door opened 6 in. A face appeared in the gap. Pale, gaunt, eyes that hadn't seen sunlight in so long they'd lost their color. Yes, the face said. Sullivan asked if this was the Dalton property. The face nodded. Sullivan asked if he was speaking to Robert or Samuel Dalton. The face smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. Both, it said. Sullivan tried to conduct an interview through that 6-inch gap in the door. He asked where they'd been, why the town thought they were dead, how they'd been living. The face, Robert's face, though Sullivan wouldn't learn which brother was which until later, answered in fragments. Said they'd been here the whole time. Said they'd gone underground when people started asking too many questions. Said their mother had told them to wait. Wait until the world forgot. Wait until it was safe to speak. Sullivan asked what they needed to be safe from. Robert's smile widened. "Our elves," he said. Then he closed the door. Sullivan drove back to Kansas City and contacted the police. He told them there were 2 elderly men living in a basement in Lawrence County, Missouri. Men who claimed to be the missing Dalton brothers. Men who clearly needed medical attention and possibly psychiatric evaluation. The Kansas City police contacted the Lawrence County Sheriff, Sheriff Wade, who'd never heard the Dalton name before that phone call. Drove out to the property on October 15th with 2 deputies and a social worker named Margaret Chen, who specialized in cases of extreme neglect and hoarding. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? They found the basement door unlocked. Wade called out, identified himself, warned that he was coming down. No answer, just silence. And that smell, food, and something else. Something chemical and old. The stairs descended into darkness. WDE's flashlight beam caught concrete walls, water stains, the skittering movement of insects. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a room, and in that room, they found the Dalton brothers. Robert and Samuel, living, breathing, sitting at a table with 2 plates of beans and bread, as if they'd been expecting company for dinner. The basement was larger than it should have been. Sheriff Wade realized that immediately. It wasn't just a cellar. It was a network of rooms carved out and expanded over decades, connected by narrow passages that ran under the house and beyond it, tunneling into the earth like the burrows of some enormous animal. There were living quarters, a kitchen area with a hot plate and shelves lined with canned goods dating back to the 40s, a sleeping area with 2 narrow cots pushed together. And then there were the other rooms, the rooms that made Deputy Harrison vomit into his handkerchief, the rooms that made Margaret Chen back away toward the stairs, shaking her head, saying, "No, no, no," under her breath like a prayer against what her eyes were showing her. There were jars, hundreds of jars lined up on wooden shelves in what had once been a root cellar. Jars filled with formaldehyde and other things, preserved things, pieces of things that had once been part of living people. Fingers, teeth, hair braided into neat coils, and photographs. Stacks and stacks of photographs, some so old the images had faded to ghosts, others more recent. All of them showing the same subjects, Robert and Samuel. Through the decades, growing older, growing stranger, but never alone. Always photographed with their mother, even in pictures that were dated from the 50s and 60s. Years after Catherine Dalton was supposed to have been dead and buried. When Wade asked them to explain, Robert did the talking. Samuel just sat there holding his brother's hand, humming softly. Robert said their mother had never died. Said death was a legal fiction, a piece of paper that meant nothing in the eyes of God or family. Said Catherine had taught them that blood was eternal, that the body was just a vessel, that there were ways to keep the essential parts, the parts that mattered, the parts that remembered. He said it calmly, the way someone might explain a recipe or a hobby. He said they'd been preparing for this conversation for 43 years, practicing what to say, how to say it. Their mother had written it all down for them, left them instructions, made them promise to wait until the waiting itself became unbearable. The deputies found Catherine Dalton in the deepest room. All what was left of her, the bones, had been carefully ranged on a bed, dressed in that gray cotton dress, positioned as if she were sleeping. Her skull rested on a pillow embroidered with her initials. Her finger bones still wore her wedding ring. Around the bed were candles burned down to puddles of wax, flowers dried to dust, and letters, dozens of letters written in 2 different hands, alternating. A conversation between Robert and Samuel and their mother that had continued for 17 years after her death. The letters talked about the people in the jaws, about how many there had been, about where they'd gone. about the quarry and the limestone, and the 200 feet of stone and water that held secrets. The brothers said they were ready to share, if only someone would ask the right questions. Sheriff Wade asked the question. He asked how many people the Dalton family had killed. Robert looked at Samuel. Samuel looked at Robert. They smiled, those same unsettling smiles that didn't reach their eyes. We stopped counting. Robert said after Father died. Mother said numbers were a distraction from the work. But if you drain the quarry, you'll find them, all of them. 40 years of them pressed between the limestone-like pages in a book. The state of Missouri drained the Dalton quarry in the spring of 1960. It took 3 months. What they found confirmed everything the brothers had confessed and suggested horrors they'd never mentioned. The bodies were there, preserved by the limestone and the cold water. Some of them still recognizable, still wearing the clothes they disappeared in decades earlier. Howard Finch, Mary Bishop, 23 others, men, women, teenagers, transients, and travelers, and people the town had forgotten or had never known were missing in the first place. The oldest remains dated back to 1913, 3 years before the first recorded disappearance, which meant William Dalton had been doing this long before his sons joined him, had been teaching them the family business the same way other fathers taught their sons to farm or keep books or run machinery. Robert and Samuel Dalton were declared incompetent to stand trial. The psychiatric evaluation took 6 weeks. The doctors said they developed something called folie douce, a shared psychosis, a madness that fed between them like an electrical current, amplified by isolation and abuse, and a mother who'd weaponized their devotion to her. The doctors said they'd been groomed since childhood to see murder as a family duty, a religious obligation, a way of keeping their mother's love. They said the brothers couldn't distinguish between right and wrong because they'd been raised in a reality where those concepts had been inverted, where violence was devotion and secrecy was survival, and the basement was the only place in the world where they were safe. They were committed to the Missouri State Hospital in Fulton. They shared a room there, too, just like they'd shared the attic and shared the basement and shared every secret their family had ever kept. They died within hours of each other in 1973. Samuel went first, a heart attack in his sleep. Robert woke to find his brother cold beside him. The nurses said he didn't cry, didn't speak, just lay down next to Samuel's body and closed his eyes. His heart stopped for hours later. The autopsy found nothing wrong with him, no disease, no injury, just a heart that had decided somewhere in the deepest part of itself that it was finished beating. The Dalton property was demolished in 1974. The house, the quarry, the basement with its network of rooms and its shelves of jars and its letters to a dead woman who'd somehow kept speaking long after her throat had turned to dust. The county filled in the quarry with concrete and dirt and planted grass over it, trying to bury the memory the same way the Daltons had buried their victims. But memories don't die that easily. The people who'd lived through it, who'd whispered about the disappearances and looked away when it mattered, they carried those memories into their old age. They told their children told their children. And now you know too, the question that haunts Lawrence County isn't how the Daltons did what they did. The mechanics of it were simple enough. Isolation, opportunity, a family name that bought silence, a quarry deep enough to swallow evidence. The question that keeps people awake at night is different. It's this: how many people knew? How many people suspected something was wrong and chose comfort over truth? Chose their jobs and their mortgages and their normal lives over the lives of strangers who disappeared into the limestone? How many people are guilty not of murder, but of the silence that allowed murder to continue for 40 years? The Dalton brothers were found in 1959. What they admitted, no one could believe. But maybe the real horror isn't what they did in that basement, in that quarry, in those rooms beneath the earth. Maybe the real horror is how easy it was. How a family can become a machine for death and a town can become its accomplice. And nobody stops it. Because stopping it would mean admitting they'd known all along. That's the secret the Daltons took to their grave. Not the number of victims, not the methods, but how simple it is for evil to thrive. When good people decide that silence is safer than speaking. When family loyalty becomes more important than human life. When the monsters aren't hiding in the dark. They're sitting at dinner tables, going to church, signing paychecks, being called upstanding citizens, while bodies sink slowly into limestone to 100 feet below the surface of the world. Sleep well tonight, and remember, the Daltons aren't unique.